Well, hey everyone, my name is Nathan Jones, and if you're new here, welcome. I like to talk about all things movies, specifically Blu-rays, and today we are continuing with my film journey. I've been doing this for 9 weeks now. I've been physically writing down the things that I've been watching, the movies and the television shows that I've been checking out, and also the things that I've been picking up. And it's been a total blast. It's been really refreshing going back into this medium with this and just having like a weekly breakdown of the things that I've been checking out. It has been really nice in terms of seeing myself within a lot of these films. So, with that being said, we have a lot of stuff to talk about today. We are finally in fall, and so it is starting to become a little bit spookier outside, and I'm definitely in the horror mood. Even though it's not yet October, I'm definitely getting into that space, and you'll see some of those with the titles that I chose to watch this week. But there's some other really fun things to talk about as well. And I'm going to start first with some of the Blu-rays that I picked up for some various hauls that I got during the week. One of them, one haul that I will make a separate video for, is the Hamilton book haul. I actually ordered quite a bit of titles from Hamilton Book for a really good price, because Hamilton Books always makes terrific deals in terms of a lot of their titles that they put out. But I'm going to make a separate video for that. But the first thing I want to talk about are some Lynch titles. But before we jump into what I picked up, I would love to know what you've been watching and what you've been picking up for the week. Let me know in the comment section. I want to see kind of where October is right around the corner. August just ended. What is September to you? What have you been watching for September? All right, so let's jump into the Lynch titles that I picked up. And there's 3 of them right here. One of them is not a Lynch-directed film, but it is on Lynch. The first film I want to talk about is Wild at Heart from 1990. It's got Nicolas Cage and Laura Dern. This is the Shout Select version right here, the number 46, if you care about the spine and whatnot, but I really could care less. But with that being said, I've been wanting to watch this movie for some time. I've kind of always blown it off because I wasn't a Lynch fan for the most part, but after watching Twin Peaks, I'm definitely on board. So Wild at Heart is going to be a fun time. I'm excited for it. I've heard that's a pretty zany film with some zany actors, right? The other film that I picked up was Inland Empire from Criterion. This is a recent release from Criterion, or at least recent in the last couple of years. It's my number 1175. And I've heard this film in particular is one of the tougher films to get into in terms of Lynch's filmography. But I'm really excited about it because I have kind of reevaluated myself with Lynch, of course, as I just mentioned, watching Twin Peaks and enjoying Mulholland Drive. Honestly, I think I'm going to enjoy Blue Velvet the next time I watch it, so this is going to be a lot of fun to check back into. And the last film that I picked up is actually on David Lynch, not directed by him. It is actually a documentary from 2016. This is my number 895, also from Criterion. It is David Lynch, The Art Life. And this one looks really, really peculiar and really, really exciting. It's directed by John Eugen, Rick Barnes, Olivia Nygaard-Holm. So there's a lot of people involved in this, but I've been fascinated with David Lynch's world view and a lot of the different things that he's been going on. And we'll talk more about David Lynch later on in this video, but I did want to cover some of the things that I picked up, some of the holes on my shelf in terms of his filmography and films on him. So I'm definitely in that mood. But let's shift gears from the things that I picked up to some of the titles that I watched for the week. And that film is The Boy and the Heron. One that I'm kicking myself for not watching in theaters. I know. I didn't watch this in theaters, and it's definitely a bad move on my part. But I did finally check this movie out, and it looks terrific. I love the kinetic energy that Miyazaki put into this. Especially, it feels very fluid. It feels like a very fluid looking film. If anyone's familiar with Miyazaki films, I mean, you should be, of course, things like Spirited Away or My Neighbor Totoro, you know his art style. He is very iconic in that sense, and this film felt like a love letter to his son, but also a love letter to his films in the past and what is coming in the future, right? Or maybe letting go of the past and that past to move on to the future. That's where a lot of the themes kick in, where I feel like it's a double-sided thing here where we're talking more about Miyazaki himself and also the protagonists and characters in this story. And this is a great one too, and it definitely reminds me of like Howl's Moving Castle meets Spirited Away in weird ways. That's probably the best thing I would probably describe this as. I love the different characters in here, especially Robert Pattinson, who plays the Heron. who is terrific and honestly unrecognizable in his voice acting. I watched the English version of this, and it actually has a really fantastic cast here. Christian Bale, Dave Bautista, Willem Dafoe, Gemma Chan, Karen Fukuhara, Florence Pugh, Mark Hamill. It's a really great cast. But I am curious to check out the Japanese versions of these as well. I've never watched many Studio Ghibli films in Japanese, which is probably a little thing for me. But I'd give this film a 4.5 out of 5. It is that good. It is really, really good. It's a love letter to Miyazaki and possibly his last film. And I definitely recommend people check this movie out. If you've not seen it yet, I'm definitely one of the last ones to watch it finally. Now we're going to jump into some horror films because we are in the spooky season. So those films are actually a peculiar pairing that I made this last week. One that is dedicated to the folk horror box set that is coming out from Severin, All the Haunts Be Ours Volume 2, which I'm ecstatic about. But I wanted to choose two films that I had on my shelf that I hadn't seen before. That's Wakewood from 2009 and the Earth from 2021. And these were some really fun folk horror films. So let's talk about Wakewood first. This is a little Irish film from 2009. It is actually Hammer Studios put this film out, and which I thought was really great. And they've definitely make some modern classics in terms of some of the horror stuff, but they're definitely known for their time in the 70s, right? But this was a fun little Irish folk horror film. It definitely had some moments of, I think, the budget itself definitely lends itself a little off in terms of believability and the acting and just the kind of the cinematography in general was a little off for me. But the other end of the spectrum is the atmosphere was great. I loved the close-up kills that this little girl, this undead little girl and this townfolk that is very much like the Wicker Man meets Pet Sematary. That's probably the vibes I'd give this movie. It's a lot of fun. But regardless, I would say 2.5 out of 5. It's not the end of the world, but it's definitely a fun time, especially if you're into folk horror, and definitely check it out if you haven't seen it yet. Now, on the other hand, there is this 2021 film directed by Ben Wheatley, who I have seen A Field in England and a couple of other films like Meg 2, of course, Ben Wheatley. I mean, if that name comes to mind, that's what comes to mind is Meg 2. But In the Earth is another folk horror film. This came out right in the midst of the pandemic, and it definitely has some of those elements, I feel like, just the socio-political elements that are almost invested into this film just because of the time that it came out. I don't know when this was made per se in terms of when they shot this film, but you can definitely tell there's some paranoia and some fear going on during this time. But this film is a post-apocalyptic, or there's this viral thing that's been going on in the world, and so this couple is out in the woods kind of living on their own, escaping a lot of this, and they really can't trust anybody, and the Earth itself can't be trusted. And that's all I'll really say about this movie. But if anyone's seen something like A Field in England, you know that Ben Wheatley is really good on playing on our senses and the atmosphere itself. And that's where, the title of the film itself, In the Earth, kind of gives it away in terms of what to be looking out for. But there's a lot of unsettling things going on in this movie and some really great performances. Overall, I would give this movie a 3 out of 5. It was a fun time. It definitely had some lull moments where I feel like it could go in certain different directions, but overall, visually, this was a crafty film, and I loved Ben Wheatley's direction. So definitely check this movie out. A really fun double feature of Wakewood and In the Earth. So during the week, I had a pretty busy week, but for some reason I was able to check out a lot of things, and I only had a little bit of time, so I wanted to watch some films that were more around like the 90-minute mark or something a little shorter than that. So I actually pulled this set that I've had on my shelf for some time now. I actually was able to watch one of these films a couple years ago, but I never finished the set itself. So I finished the Forgotten Jolly Volume 1 box set from Vinegar Syndrome, and I finally watched Police Are Blundering in the Dark, and I finished Trauma. I've already seen The Killer is One of the 13, and that was a fun film, but let's talk about some of these Forgotten Jollies. All right, let's first start off with The Police Are Blundering in the Dark from 1972, directed by Helia Colombo. I think I say that correctly. I don't know. Regardless, this is actually probably, I will say spoilers, this might be my favorite of the bunch, even though the title itself leads nothing to what the film actually is. The police show up in like the last 5 minutes of the movie, but this is about a killer who is killing all these beautiful women. It's a jolly film, right? It's a Jollo. And there's a photographer as well, and this is kind of the heart of the film itself, is following this photographer and seeing all these glorious deaths with a pair of scissors. It's a lot of fun, and there's actually some really gruesome stuff in here, but it is a low-budget slasher, of course. This is why it's in that Forgotten Jolly box set. So it's definitely nothing to write home about, but it's definitely a fun time, and I definitely recommend people check this stuff out if you are definitely into the schlock and of the slashers. So this was a fun time, and I watched it in the Italian dub, and it was, yeah, I would say this is a solid 2.5 out of 5. Definitely one of the better films from this box set, and we'll get to Trauma here in a second, but definitely I liked it much better than the first film in the box set, which is that the killer is one of the 13. But yeah, this is probably my favorite so far. But let's now jump to Trauma. So jumping to Trauma, which is actually, I feel like, the cover itself of this entire box set, and actually, and in the order of sequences, is the first film in this box set, so I definitely went a little bit backwards. But this movie came out in 1978, so it's one of the latter of the Jolly films in terms of this box set. And this movie is definitely a daylight horror film. It's one that is set up very much in reminiscent of Psycho, so you can definitely tell there's maybe a character that is possibly a red herring, I don't know, I'm not going to give too much away, of somebody who's a little, a loose cannon, if you will, in these brightly lit rooms. But this woman right here, who is actually the owner of this hotel, out in the middle of the woods, out of nowhere, is taking all these people in. But there's these deaths coming in left and right, and out on the side of the road where cars are being broken down into, and people in their beds as they're having, a lot of really fun times. It's a Giallo, so you're gonna see a lot of fun times, if you know what I mean. And that's what this movie definitely shows you, full frontal in that kind of that way. But it's definitely a fun time, even though it is like that daylight horror. It's one of I would say this is probably my second favorite film in this box set, but it was just a really terrific, fun thing to go through these sets. And I honestly am really excited to jump into more Italian horror films in general, because I have a lot on my shelf that I haven't watched. So this actually might be my first toe dip into a lot of this stuff outside of Argento and the typical Giallo that you would expect. But yeah, overall, this box set is a lot of fun. This movie, 2.5 out of 5 as well. I would say, just like The Police Are Blundering in the Dark. It's a fun set, and I'm glad that I picked this up when I did, because I think I know it's out of print now, or if it isn't out of print, I don't think it's in this particular box itself, but you can still get the films from Vinegar Syndrome. But definitely check out some of these movies. This is a set that I feel like if you are a hardcore Giallo fan, that's definitely the recommendation to pick up this set. But overall, if you're not, you might skip this one. But it's still a fun time nonetheless. All right, so the next film I want to talk about is one I actually watched on streaming, but I have it on disc, and I just was lazy and didn't go to my other room. And I rewatched Cobweb. And I really love this film from a couple years back. This is starring Lizzie Kaplan and Anthony Starr. I really fell in love with this movie a couple years ago when it first came out, and it kind of chilled me to how eerie and atmospheric this movie is. But it was really fun to just kind of revisit it with some space. And it definitely was a little bit less effective in some of the way that it was presented, as most things are, because I know what to expect, really. But this eerie, creepy character who is living within the walls, we don't know exactly what it is. And these parents, who I mentioned, Lizzie Kaplan and Anthony Starr, are really maybe a little bit more than meets the eye in terms of their overbearingness. But we have this young Peter, 8-year-old Peter, who is played wonderfully by this guy right here, who I am blanking on his name. But he was terrific, actually, in this film, and nobody believes him. It's like the boy who cried wolf in terms of something's going on. Every single night he's hearing something in his walls, and he doesn't know what to do about it. And he keeps going to his parents, who, like I said, are more than meets the eye, and definitely are in denial the entire time. It's creepy, it's eerie, it's a really great transition into the fall, I think, and this spooky movie in particular. He's definitely one of the best ones, and definitely I would recommend people check this movie out. I've talked about it several times on the channel, but I would give this movie a 3.5 out of 5. It's that good. It's really a really good time, and one of the better modern horror films with some really creepy imagery, and that's all I'll say about it. All right, so stepping away from horror for just a bit, we're going to get back, don't worry. We're going to talk about some Westerns. And for some reason, I've been in this mood, mainly because I just actually guested on one of my friend's podcasts that will come out later, and we'll talk about that. But the film that I wanted to talk about on that podcast was The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. And I have this terrific 4K from Paramount Presents. I got this a few years ago when it was announced. I believe this was the first 4K that Paramount Presents put out in general, and really ecstatic by it. This film in particular is a John Ford film, and if you are familiar with John Ford, you of course know things like The Searchers or Stagecoach, movies like that where there's these really gorgeous backdrops of the actual West. This movie is mostly shot in the studio, and we have John Wayne and James Stewart as our main characters, and we have Lee Marvin as Liberty Valance himself. Terrific. All those people are terrific in this movie. Vera Miles is terrific, and we also even have Lee Van Cleef just as a Liberty Valance as one of his lackeys, and they're all terrific in this movie. But it really is a character-driven piece. You know, I mentioned the atmosphere of the film not necessarily being as, you know, bombastic as you'd expect it from something like John Ford, but this movie is driven on dialogue and definitely a lot of hostility that is bent up in a lot of the words and actions that are taking place in this movie. But I love this movie because there's a lot of different themes to unpack, and I'll talk more about that in that podcast. But there's themes of masculinity and the Old West dying, and this movie came out in 1962, so a lot of the films, and Westerns in particular, had been relegated to television and had been more on the television. It's kind of been a market where it kind of got oversaturated in that, and those Westerns had to shift, right? And they had to shift to things that were like spaghetti Westerns. They had to have a little bit more grit, a little bit more of that, you know, bloody and, you know, morally gray characters that would come out in the films, like from Sam Peckinpah or Sergio Leone, for instance. But this film is really, really wonderful. I love the performances here. There's a lot of, like I said, subtle themes that I think are really fascinating to dive into, and the actual shots of when Liberty Valance falls is terrific, and you go back to it back and forth, and I love it. And black and white, I also didn't mention that either. This is stunning black and white photography, and in 4K it looks terrific. Black and white films in 4K are some of my favorites, but this movie right here, 4.5 or a 5 out of 5. It's one of those perfect films that I adore, and that's the reason I chose it on that podcast. Which, yeah, if anyone hasn't seen this movie, check it out. I wouldn't recommend anyone this be their first Western. This is definitely an homage to a lot of the Westerns that came before it. But definitely check out The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Great 4K from Paramount Presents. So that wasn't all that I wanted to do in terms of Westerns. I was in that mood, right? So I wanted to check out another box set, and I started the Vengeance Trails box set from Arrow Video. 4 Western classics right here. I was only able to watch one of these films, and there's the films themselves. Massacre Time, My Name is Pecos, Bandidos, and God Said to Cain. So I finally watched this Lucio Fulci film, Massacre Time, which has this entire other title, an Italian title, which I really love as well, but I'm probably going to butcher it if I could find it. Anyway, it's something to do about the cult saying death and saying Massacre Time, which is a crazy and great title for this film. So this came out in 1966. It's Fulci. You would expect a horror film, but it's a Western. And it's got Franco Nero in it, and it also has a really another great cast of why am I blanking up? Jeff Hilton, who is his brother in this movie, and these brothers are estranged, but we have Franco Nero coming back into town after kind of be driven away from it, and the town has been taken over by this family that is definitely corrupt and definitely harasses as many people as they can. His brother is now a drunk, and it's fun to see them interact, but you can tell that they're not getting any shit done to figure out why this family had taken over town. But Massacre Time is the title of the film itself, and you don't see that massacre kind of towards the end, but it's definitely one of the greatest Western fights I've seen in, around this time period. And I'm really shy when it comes to a lot of these films that are not outside of Sergio Leone films. So I'm not as familiar with a lot of the spaghetti westerns of this time. So it's going to be fun to dive into these titles. But I really loved this movie, and it's got a really great soundtrack as well. It has a great song that's connected to this movie. But it is wild to kind of see a Fulci film that kind of lacks a little bit of blood. It definitely has some grit. It has some gunfights, and it also has a really cool whip sequence that kind of goes on a little longer than it should, but it's definitely violent in that sense. But yeah, Massacre Time, 3.5 out of 5. Really fun time, definitely recommend, and I'm excited to jump into that Vengeance Trails box set. All right, so recently there might have been a holiday that happened this week, and I'm talking a little bit about Friday the 13th. Now, it is September, Friday the 13th, so it's not as cool as October necessarily, but I watched 2 Friday the 13th films. I wanted to do a double feature for the day. I was just so excited that it was the Friday the 13th, and actually, there's 2 people at work who are horror films fans like me, but there's very few of us there. Most of them do not like horror films at all. They find people who like horror films to be a little weird, which we are, but here the thing is, I wanted to watch part 3 and part 6, Jason Lives, which is actually my favorite film, which we'll get to. But let's get to part 3, which is one that I feel like people either really like or they don't. And I am in the really like camp. This is actually one of my favorite of the Friday the 13th films, which is weird. This is Friday the 13th part 3 in 3D, which this comes in 3D and also 2D. Of course, I watched the 2D version of this. I don't have a 3D TV, and I don't have that capacity for that. But there are a lot of really cool effects that you can definitely tell was made for this this gimmick that they were going to do. But Jason's back, of course, in full fashion. This is actually the second time we've really seen Jason. Of course, if you are familiar with the Friday the 13th movies, you know where I'm going and coming from. But it is a rehash of 2, I would say, which is where some of the detractors may come from. But really creative kills. I loved a lot of the barnyard kills that would happen in this with pitchforks and whatnot, and a couple of pickaxes. But it was a fun time, and there was even a harpoon scene. That's one of my favorites as well. And yeah, this was just a really fun return to Camp Crystal Lake and see Jason kind of get his mask for the first time too. It's just a fun film, and yeah, I implore you, if you are not a fan of this film, to check it out again, because it's just a good time. So I know I said I was going to do a double feature, and I fully intended to, but I totally crashed and fell asleep. And I go to bed at 9:30 now, so that's just how it is. But in the morning, early morning, I watched part 6 right here, Jason Lives, Kill or Be Killed. This is my favorite Friday the 13th film. I mean, this is definitely one of the better ones. It is a film that has a lot of really great kills, of course, as we're used to this franchise, but it also has a lot of meta humor to it, and very... the fourth wall breaking it happens a lot in this movie, but there's also a lot of really hilarious comedic moments, and I love that balance. This is one of those films that was, I feel like, balanced the best. It also introduces the supernatural elements where Jason finally comes back from the grave. He hadn't really died before necessarily. He's died a few times, but there wasn't really much in terms of the supernatural side, bringing him back into this really scary and an almost invincible character, which is where, future Jason films would go towards. And it's just so much fun. I'd give this movie a 4 out of 5. It's terrific. I don't think I mentioned part 3, but I also give that one a 4 out of 5. Maybe a 3.5 out of 5 is probably more apt to what it should be. But man, these films are so much fun. And it's always fun to jump into Friday the 13th when the holiday is right. And the last set of films I want to talk about are Lynch adjacent. I told you I would be talking about David Lynch again, and of course I couldn't quit. So I jumped back into the Twin Peaks box set and wanted to watch some more extra features, so I did. I watched a documentary from 2007. It is Secrets from Another Place, and that was a documentary kind of the cast looking back at the first 2 seasons and also Fire Walk with Me, and really just reliving and revisiting some of the behind-the-scenes stuff for what they did, and then also just the fact that like this whole cult of Twin Peaks existed in the media and just had not seen anything like this. Television was unlike this during the early 1990s, so it was just a really, really fantastic way to kind of look at the characters, glean of how much they enjoyed working with David Lynch and enjoyed this entire journey. And then, of course, the return would come out later, so they would jump back into it a little bit later. But it was cool to see the cast kind of just talk about that time period, and a time period that I was around for, but I wasn't cognizant of it. And so it was really fun to see. But the other films that I want to kind of get away from the Twin Peaks documentary, and now we're going to jump into the world of Oz, because I want to talk about this little thing right here, Lynch and Oz. But first, I have to rewatch Wizard of Oz. I have the Blu-ray right here. I actually just ordered the 4K because it was on sale. But I did watch the Blu-ray version of the Wizard of Oz. What can be said about this movie? I've seen this movie dozens and dozens of times, probably 30 plus times. This is one of the earliest film memories of mine, is watching this movie and kind of getting lost into this world. So this movie came out in 1939, directed by Victor Fleming, of course, and starring Judy Garland as Dorothy. Of course, I'm sure a lot of people have seen this movie, so I don't want to talk about it too much in depth, because this is definitely a film that I feel like if you watch this movie, you, especially as early on as a kid, this is a movie that will open doors for you in terms of watching other type of films and just fantasy in general. And it's one of those terrific worlds that I think people can get lost into. Of course, there's been a lot of adaptations of this story and a lot of different directions it goes, but I loved going back to this, and it was splendid thinking about it in terms of David Lynch, which we'll get to here in a second, but just revisiting this in more modern context. I haven't seen this movie probably in a couple of years, and it was just really fun to see this adventure again, that one that is tried and true, one that I have seen on numerous occasions. It has really bright lights and some dark undersides to it, which gets me to this little thing right here, this David Lynch and Oz documentary directed by Alexander O'Phillip. And this is a really great, almost like video essay type of documentary, where we have 6 different visions of different people who are looking at the various works of David Lynch and seeing the similarities to Oz and the Wizard of Oz in general, and looking at a lot of those thematic overlays, and the fact that David Lynch himself has this childlike wonder that is very bright, but also at the same time very dark underneath, and it tells you a lot about the type of person David Lynch is. And I don't want to get into a lot of the themes here, but definitely recommend checking this out if anyone is familiar with some of David Lynch's stuff or the Wizard of Oz. It's really cool to kind of see a lot of these things jump around. In fact, there's even one moment in this, I guess he had an interview in the mid-90s, I believe in 1997, where he talked a lot about routine and having that as a basis. And as that basis happens, you can have a springboard for creative endeavors that seem outlandish, but at the same time are very grounded in something. But that quote I'm paraphrasing really struck a deep chord within me, as somebody who has a routine himself and really is striving towards having this structure of doing something daily, and doing something like this film journal in a weird way. And there's a lot of similarities I see here, where I can start going off in any direction, and the sky's the limits for that, and the creative endeavors that one can go through, just being solidified into something like this. It's hard to explain. Definitely clicked with me a lot more, but it's a really fantastic documentary. Going back to Wizard of Oz, 5 out of 5. It's a masterpiece. It's a great film. And that particular documentary, it might be a 4.5 out of 5. It's one that really stuck with me, and I'm super pumped to jump into more of David Lynch's work, kind of revisiting his filmography among other things, and just kind of highlighting that with Oz, really. And I'm honestly getting back into the world of Oz, which is just a really fascinating journey and juxtaposition to see that kind of overlap in those themes. But with that being said, I want to know down in the comment section down below what you've been checking out for the week. I hope you enjoyed this film journey. Week 9 is quite a doozy, and it's been a lot of fun. So the next time I see you, we're going to be talking about Hamilton book and a little haul that I did. It's quite a substantial haul. We'll get into that later, but I hope you enjoyed this video. Give it a like, comment down below, share, hit the notification bell, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. I'm not jonesing around.